Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning to all our participants. We wait a minute and then we are starting. I think if it's fine, we will be recording this proceeding. So we trust that that is in order with everyone. We will have our speakers take the floor first, and then we will have your questions and comments. So certainly, as we go along, please insert questions as indicated in the chat box or comments, but we will use those and perhaps also take a few from the floor, but it would be best if you would add your comments and questions in the chat box. So good morning, good afternoon, I think, for our colleagues in East Africa, and good day to everyone, wherever you are. You are most welcome to this webinar on the inclusion of refugees in Africa in health, education, and sports in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. I think our speakers will elucidate the topic and take it from various perspectives, the perspective of education, health, and to a certain extent, sports. But let me just link this to the time in which we find ourselves. As we know, 20 June every year is World Refugee Day. We celebrate World Refugee Day. And that was obviously yesterday. So this is the Center for Human Rights effort to also commemorate and remind ourselves of the plight of refugees and look for ways in which we can collectively also work towards the improvement. I think this is an African-focused event, but this is also a worldwide celebration. Sometimes people wonder, but why is it 20 June? And I think this date reminds us also of the way in which this day came to be celebrated. It was actually initially celebrated around the date of the entry into force of the OAU Refugee Convention of 1969, right? So that was 20 June 1974 that convention entered into force. And initially it was celebrated as Africa Refugee Day, but this became the impetus for the United Nations General Assembly to recognize World Refugee Day and then to also link it to 20 June. So I think it is a very interesting, telling example of how an African-focused initiative really becomes globalized. Often, things work the other way around, but this instance shows us the initiative can come from the African continent. The year 1951 also comes into mind here. We know that this year would be 70 years since the adoption of the UN Refugee Convention in 1951. And for many reasons, I think it is important to focus on this World Refugee Day, on these milestones, but certainly contextualize them within the reality of COVID-19. So that's really the added impetus of this particular day. We know that the day theme is around the inclusion of refugees, in particularly education, health, and in sports, exactly because COVID exacerbated the exclusion and draw our attention increasingly to the need for inclusion. But against that background, I thank the speakers who are lined up here. Let me just say, if you received the program, you would have seen that there is a list of speakers, but one of our speakers, the last speaker, is not able to be with us today because of the elections in Ethiopia. So we hope 5 speakers. We asked them to speak around 12, 13 minutes so that there would be time for our engagement questions and responses. So without any further ado, let me turn to our first speaker on the list, and that is Dr. Alehone Abebe. Dr. Alehone Abebe, as I know you see from the program, is the Assistant Representative for Protection at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in South Sudan. He had previously worked in a number of capacities. Among others, he was a senior legal officer at the African Union, seconded by the UN UNHCR from 2017 to 2021. For us at the Center for Human Rights, we count him as one of our alumni. He has done the Masters in Human Rights and Democratization in Africa with us. He continued to do his PhD. He's well published in this area. We really look forward. We thank you, Dr. Aloni, for your presence here today. And you have indicated that you'll speak specifically to the inclusion of refugees in educational programs. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Franz. Let me share my screen. I'm trying to see. Yolanda, maybe can you help me share the screen? I can't see it here. My presentation. Okay, maybe this. Yes.
We go.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes,
can you see my presentation?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Professor Franz. Thank you to all this impressive network of human rights students and actors. I am privileged to be a part of this conversation. Always a unique opportunity to be a part of this family. Since this is the first time I'm, interacting with this community after the unfortunate death of our professor. Hence, allow me to express my sadness about that tragic death, but his legacy will continue, and particularly as we now discuss the protection of the most vulnerable among the population that we have, and also to thank you for the opportunity given to UNHCR to do is to interact with this community. This year we are celebrating and marking the Refugee Day with the theme We Heal, Learn and Shine. I am based currently in South Sudan, and one of the comment I hate is they get surprised because they know South Sudan as a country of war and conflict and internal displacement. But they also ignore and they don't know that actually South Sudan hosts a very large number of refugees from different countries. Currently, close to 320,000 refugees are hosted in some areas, pockets of stability in South Sudan, coming from my own country, Ethiopia, Sudan, DRC, and Central African Republic. And this is often the generosity that's not acknowledged. And in fact, we just released as UNHCR what we call a global trends report, which clearly shows that 86% of the global refugee figure, 86% are hosted in developing countries or less developed countries. And from the region in Eastern Horn of Africa, 4.5 million refugees are hosted, and double that number of internally displaced persons. And I think when we even recognize the Refugees Day and celebrate the resilience of refugees, we have to also recognize that 48 million people don't have that privilege of looking for safety across the border, so they are internally displaced. Now you know that countries like Somalia, Ethiopia, DRC, South Sudan have massive number of people who are trapped in their own country but displaced with little access to the needed protection and solution. And why is it very interesting, this figure, and alarming is also the fact that these are the countries that also share the little they have when it comes to education, health, and those services with refugees. So children, I mean, when you talk about refugees in places like South Sudan, 82% are children and women and children. And especially the issue of those of you who are fathers, I mean, Father's Day yesterday, and even as a father myself, this is the impact displacement has on children is massive and huge. There is a famous line from one of the great poets, you look at the world once in childhood, the rest is memory. And we as UNHCR and humanitarian partners, we don't like children to live with memory of displacement, but sadly, that's a reality. So investing on children's education is central to our programs and to the programs by UNHCR partners across the world and largely also in Africa. We have globally a new approach to enhance inclusion of refugees across programs. You have heard about this new compact, which resulted from what globally was considered as refugee crisis in 2015. But just let me say one thing. There is no, when you look at the numbers, there is no refugee crisis in the Western world. The refugee crisis largely, as I said, the figures speak, is here in continent like Africa and in some of the least developed countries in the Middle East. But then that global compact was necessitated by this desire to help countries which are really hosting large number of refugees to ease pressure on their economies and also support self-reliance, reliance of refugees, resilience of refugees themselves. Because this, if you want to build a future for refugees, supporting them to be self-reliant is critical, and also how to expand access to third countries. So we are looking at resettlement and other options. You'll be struck by this figure that only 1% of refugees across the world have access to resettlement. Only 1%. And so the rest are really host, and some of them is trapped in displacement, refugee camps for a long time. You know the story in Kenya, where refugees were born and raised in camps. In places like Ethiopia, which is also generous to refugees, but has like 26 camps. Mostly refugees being, having little access to life around them and only depending on humanitarian assistance. And so how to also change that is the ambition of the Global Compact, and also support conditions for safe and dignified return. And so education is really central. Again, but the fact is only 2% in countries like South Sudan have access to tertiary education. The privilege of going to university. How can you build life and future and get dignified future if only 3% of refugees have access globally? And in South Sudan, for instance, 2%. We have made some headways. For instance, here in South Sudan, 78% of refugees have access to a primary school. That's significant, and we are very pleased. But the higher you go, the less in terms of access. Higher education, only 37% in South Sudan, which is, slightly higher than the global average, but still way off. And so we need, and it's such as achievable when you look at even the global, the SDG plans. But for the refugees, access to education, it remains. And then I think other colleagues will talk about, COVID and give you specific examples that COVID has disrupted the enrollment and the continuing education of refugees. We were pleased with some programs in countries like Uganda, even in South Sudan, how to continue with a little investment to help the refugees continue their education. But the COVID has brought significant challenge to access to education for refugees globally. Then let me also talk about the food insecurity in some places and how that's linked. In South Sudan currently, places like Ethiopia, they are going through a significant challenge when it comes to food insecurity. Part of it is also the effect of climate change. In South Sudan, refugees have 50% reduction of when IDPs faced reduction of budget cuts. This is because the WFP and other partners are having significant challenge when it comes to their funding. And so, which means it has consequences for education. School feeding programs are cut. Children in their like schools, you can't go to school, with little food in your system. And this is an issue that I really wanted to highlight as in South Sudan. I just want to finish quick so that questions. I mean, we are also seeing significant return in a country like more than 390,000 refugees returned, and it means we need to scale up our response and promoting access to education and services. But the challenges are immense. People are returning. school kids with their family, but some of them joining IDP camps because there is no program for them that's sufficient to help them regain their dignity, have access to education, and so forth. What do? We just talk to them and identify some of the needs they have and mobilize global support, provide assistance, and activate some of the programs. Return is always emotional, but then behind those smiles and emotional reunion of family, still they wake up tomorrow and they find out that the kids don't have schools to go to, and they don't have sufficient food and access to medicine, in light of also the current COVID and its significant impact on local population and ongoing areas in South Sudan. Let me close by saying that for us as UNHCR, we really want to see how to support the life of refugees and IDPs by creating some programs which help them to rebuild like building bricks. It could be and getting engaged in some activity that help. But how can you engage in this kind of activity if you are not supported with education opportunity? And so we have a program actually by 2013 to increase access to tertiary education and vocational programs by 15 to 50 from current reality of 2 to 3%. And this means organizations, academic institutions like Center for Human Rights can do something to change that. In addition to the capacity building and organizing this webinar, and I am going to propose, that's our Center for Human Rights, stands with refugees with concrete pledges, at least 2 slots for refugees in the master's program starting next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we just stopped the screen sharing there. Dr. Alehone, thank you very much for your contribution. Also, I think in a sense, linking the day we celebrate, World Refugee Day, perhaps with the day that we celebrated last week, the Day of the African Child. Obviously, when we speak about education, we speak about the rights of children. So I think that is a good reminder and a good link that you focused upon. Also the various levels of education and the importance that has and how it minimizes towards the tertiary level. And then I think we've taken to heart, and we certainly will internally discuss and take up your challenge or invitation to, as a center, also look at how we, as a Center for Human Rights, can access and provide access to refugees in terms of the tertiary programs that we present, maybe the human rights program, but other programs and other activities that we present. I think it is a very practical and useful suggestion, and we really appreciate that. Thank you again. Maybe before I move on, just to welcome everyone. I think we have more than 100 participants here at the moment. In the chat box, I see that there are people who identify themselves as coming from Kenya, Uganda, and from Madagascar, the Kingdom of Eswatini, and also from Rwanda, among others. So you're welcome to just post your location there so we can see the representation that this group also manifests. I want to thank also the migration unit, the migrants unit at the center, and that is Tunde and Abi, for working hard to invite the speakers and organize this event, and our technical team, Yolanda and Taruna. We now move, and I remind people to just put comments and further suggestions or questions in the chat box as we go along, please. We move to our second speaker, Dr. Walters Samar. Dr. Samar is, in the first place, a conflict resolution and governance expert. So that is where his expertise comes from. Currently is the head of the Joint Mission Analysis Cell of the AMISOM mission, the African Union mission in Somalia. And his task there at that mission is to give strategic analyses and advisory support to the senior leadership of that management team. He's worked around the African continent, among others in Central Africa and also further afield in Haiti. He will speak around the issue of promoting education for refugees through success stories, based also, I think, on his experience with AMISOM. Thank you very much, Dr. Samar, for joining us. We look forward to your intervention. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Director, and for giving me this opportunity. Dr. Abebe has already provided the very sound context for my presentation. As you rightly said, I will be talking on promoting social inclusion of refugees in Africa through support to host communities. Perhaps I should start by saying I'm very delighted to be on this panel with such distinguished panelists and to be given the opportunity to share my thoughts on this very important theme of the year: inclusion of refugees in Africa in health, education, and in sports in the context of the COVID pandemic. This theme is of particular interest and significance to me because in my career as a peacekeeper, I've got to work with some former refugees, who are one of the brightest colleagues I've had. And some of them have shared with me what life, from their personal experiences, what life really is living and growing up in a refugee camp. Clearly, without the education, the health, the healthcare they received while they were still in the camp, provided by host communities, by government, by state, by NGOs, by UNHCR, UNICEF, and other organizations, they wouldn't have been able to be in the position they are in today, where they are able to give back to their communities and to give back to, I could say, to humanity. Refugees have the right to health, education, and sports, but a health emergency of large scale like COVID pandemic certainly challenges their access to these services in many ways. Firstly, any emergency situation that undermines the capacity of the state, the hosting state, to provide healthcare and education even to its own citizens will undoubtedly have devastating consequences on refugees. I don't know about the different countries of participants, but in the country where I come from, whether it's Somalia or in Cameroon, my country of origin, there are many stories, horrifying stories of patients who are moving from one health center to another, often being denied access, or because those health centers are overwhelmed. And some have ended up losing their lives, because of, the health services are just simply overwhelmed by the COVID pandemic. And here I'm talking about citizens, not even of refugees. With regard to education, I know of so many people who have dropped out of school because of COVID pandemic, and many are unlikely to return. The point I'm making here is that the pandemic has seriously challenged the capacity of state institutions, of health facilities, of educational providers to provide critical social services to citizens. I find this concerning simply because how can countries that are hosting refugees, how can such countries, if they can't provide those critical services to their own communities, to their own people, how can do we expect them to provide adequate services to refugees? Even more concerning is the fact that developing countries host about 82% of all refugees globally. They are classed developing countries simply because they are still dealing with development challenges. They are generally poor. In these developing countries, refugees often settle amongst the poorest communities where those critical services, health, education, are short in supply. For example, a study conducted in Kenya found that 1/3 of refugees living in that country are likely to be deprived or severely deprived regarding education and health. That same study also found that both host communities and refugees were amongst the poorest in the country in terms of associated socio-economic indicators. Given this reality, it is obvious that the COVID pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities of refugees, limiting their access to health, to education, to sports facilities, and the list goes on. This brings me to how can such problems be resolved? How can we address the problems of refugees with respect to their access to health, their access to education, their access to sport in the context of this pandemic? Here I'm going to make a few recommendations. The international community needs to increase its support to refugee hosting countries. And such support, financial support most importantly, the state must ensure that such support goes directly to assisting host communities, such that they themselves can help the refugees that are living within their communities. Interestingly, the World Bank has a special fund for the poorest countries to support refugees and their host communities. Such support can strengthen the efforts of government and local authorities to deliver health, education, and services to refugees. As African countries are dealing with the COVID health crisis, efforts must be made not to forget the rights of health, education, and sports for refugees living in their communities. With regard to education, every effort must be made for refugee children to stay in school or to return to school when and where possible, as a matter of urgency. This is because wasting 1 or 2 years, not going to school for 1 or 2 years because of the COVID pandemic can have, irreparable damage on those children. It may have long-lasting implications. Regarding health, as the continent mobilizes to vaccinate its people against the COVID pandemic, refugees and IDPs should not be forgotten. This may require designing special programs for them to vaccinate refugees. It is the right thing to do, and it is also the safest thing to do, given that refugees do not live in an island. They may live in camps, in makeshift accommodation, but of course they interact with the communities. They move around interacting on a daily basis. So if they are not vaccinated, if their healthcare needs are not taken care of, it will have a bigger impact on the wider community. And finally, a sustainable solution to providing social services to refugee children is to empower their parents, their guardians, economically, so as to enable them to take care of their children. And perhaps this is also by empowering them, giving them access to the labor market. These are a few short thoughts I wanted to share on this very important occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walters Samar. We really appreciate that. I think showing the complexities balancing between the host communities and their socioeconomic deprivation, and then those of the refugees living in those very communities. And we've taken note of your views, and I see there's a number of questions that are coming up also in that field. So I think there will be time to discuss that issue further. Just in terms of our attendees, I note someone attending from Dallas, Texas, someone from the Southern Cameroons. Welcome. I think that's an awkward hour for you. For sure. And then I think someone that we in the center have had dealings with before, Professor Khadija El-Madmad. You are most welcome. Good to see you here as well. I see Dr. Michael Adeni here. Dr. Michael Adeni is our third speaker on the list, and he is a lecturer and postgraduate coordinator at the Department of Planning and Sustainability of the University of Energy and Natural Resources in Sunyani, Ghana. He has worked in a number of areas, including the right to development, and he has worked around issues of refugees and displacement. We thank him for his time and his availability this day from Ghana. Michael, thank you very much for joining us. We in the center also count him among our treasured alumni, having been here to do the master's in human rights and democratization in Africa as well. Dr. Adeni will speak to us around the inclusion of urban refugees in education, and specifically focusing on Uganda, where he has done some work. Thank you, Dr. Adeni, and over to you. You're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Franz. First of all, I'd like to thank you and the team for inviting me to participate in this webinar. It's always home for the Center for Human Rights is a home for me, and I take this not lightly. Because of time, I'll just go directly into the presentation. So I'm focusing on protection in action, the right to education of refugees in Uganda. This is an extract from research I did during the LLM that I was in Kampala to write my thesis, which was published in the African Human Rights Law Journal. Of course, I've updated it to reflect current happenings and the dynamics on the ground. So, because the previous presenters have focused, they have talked about the international protection regime, I'm going to focus straight on the dynamics in Uganda. So, as we speak now, there are over 1.4 million refugees and asylum seekers in Uganda. And these people are being hosted in 9 districts, predominantly located in northern Uganda, Hoima, Adjumani, and Arua. The district of Adjumani hosts most of the refugees, about 23% of them. But as Uganda is known for, it has one of the most generous refugee protection regimes, whereby they have refugees who are allowed to stay in local communities, and others are also in encamped settings. So most of these refugees live in Kampala, in Mbale, Barara, Arua, Adjumani, Gulu, and other communities. Therefore, they are able to access social services and other facilities provided by the government. But sometimes we have these policies. The challenge is with the implementation, as in most African countries. However, Uganda's integrated refugee response, which incorporates the host communities, as I've mentioned, and allow refugees to enjoy various services, have been touted as a model or a best practice to be emulated by other African countries. This is a map showing where refugees in Uganda are located. As I mentioned, Adjumani is in the northeastern part of Uganda, where I happen to conduct some of my field work. Most of the refugees in Uganda are from South Sudan, in Rwanda, Burundi, Ethiopia, and Eritrea, and other countries in Eastern Africa. When they enter Uganda, a normal human instinct, most of them will not want to be encamped, because encampment denies them of various fundamental human rights, such as the right to health, education, right to work, and other fundamental human rights. So most of them want to live in the cities, to be locally integrated, so that they will be able to survive and provide basic necessities for their families. Now, let me quickly take us through the refugee protection regime in Uganda. In Uganda, the constitution do not mention anything about the refugees, even though Uganda has ratified all the relevant international covenants. And at the regional level, Uganda has also ratified the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the Children's African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of Children and all that. But in reality, the Constitution do not even mention refugees at all. But then the Constitution have some rights that everybody is entitled to, using words such as everyone is entitled to, every human being is entitled to. And it has been argued that these provisions are also for refugees. These provisions are also for refugees. For instance, if you look at Article 45 of the Constitution, it provides that the rights, duties, declarations, and guarantees relating to fundamental and other human rights and freedoms specifically provided under the Bill of Rights shall not be regarded as excluding others not specifically mentioned. So the implication is that human rights enshrined in international and regional instruments ratified by Uganda cannot be excluded from the right guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. However, the international legal framework has not always been in practice translated into respect for the human rights of urban refugees and other refugees in other settings. The rule of law and respect for and promotion of human rights therefore still remains very weak in Uganda because of the political and socio-economic conditions. Also, the rights of refugees, as I mentioned, are not specifically mentioned. Therefore, Mulumba and Olema argues that the phrase all persons include refugees, and therefore may be argued that this guarantees the right of refugees to equality and freedom from discrimination, especially in critical social services such as healthcare, education, and even housing, if it is being provided. However, critical to the right of refugees is Article 29, which guarantees and protects the rights of every person to education. Therefore, children and even adults are entitled to these rights. But as is always the case, it is children who are always in need because of the provision of free education in certain jurisdictions in Africa, such as Uganda. So in Article 32, there's a strong constitutional provision which prohibits all laws, cultures, customs, traditions which are against the dignity, welfare, or interest of women or any other marginalized groups. And as it is a common knowledge, refugees are globally recognized as marginalized group and vulnerable. And therefore, it can be argued that they fall within the ambit of this constitutional provision. Although the Constitution consists of principles that can be weighed against each other, and the rights guaranteed in Article 29 may consequently be limited and weighed against other rights, it can be argued that since the refugees are recognized as vulnerable groups, when it comes to balancing of rights, their fundamental human rights have to be prioritized unless it poses risk to national security or public health. Now let us look at the constitutional right to education, which is the subject matter of my presentation. So the Constitution of 1995 entitles a child to basic education, the provision of which shall be the duty of the state and the parents of the child, according to Article 32(1). This particular provision makes it difficult for refugees to access basic education when their parents cannot fulfill this duty due to the economic conditions. As we know, most refugees, when they are in flight, they lose their property and other forms of investment. And when they enter the third countries or they enter a country, they usually do not have any form of livelihood. So this constitutional provision that makes payment of educational services a responsibility of the government and the parents is a big barrier to refugee children when it comes to accessing education. The Constitution further provides that no child shall be deprived by any person of medical treatment, education, or other social or economic benefit by reason of religion or other opinion. And as I'm arguing, in practice, usually refugees are discriminated against because sometimes they even lack basic documentation, which most countries, including Uganda, are always hesitant in providing to refugees. This is a picture I got from a World Bank document. The source is United Nations High Commission.
Hello, Teruna. Are we hearing Michael still?
No, I think he has frozen.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. It seems like he has frozen. It's you've taken down these slides. Michael, can you hear us? Okay, Michael, we will come back, but I think we got the gist of Michael's presentation. We will revert back to those issues once we have established our contacts with him. Again, just to note again, please make your comments and pose your questions in the chat box as we go along. We welcome all our participants, anyone who joined late. We have seen people from around the continent, in fact, around the world. I note also participants identifying themselves as being from Italy, from Botswana, from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I note also our colleagues from the Refugee Law Project at Makerere University in Uganda. Let us move to our next speaker, our fourth speaker. That is Tlengiwe Mchacha, and she is the manager at the Refugee Law Clinic with Lawyers for Human Rights here in Pretoria, where we are, the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria is as well. She has an LLB degree from KwaZulu-Natal, University of KwaZulu-Natal. She has worked in various capacities with the Lawyers for Human Rights, and she is now managing the Refugee Law Clinic. And in that capacity, she advises and assists refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants to realize their constitutional rights in South Africa. Thank you so much, Tlengiwe, for making yourself available. We really appreciate, and we look forward also to your perspective being shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you to the university for inviting me. I just want to say that I did share my presentation with Tunde, but I'm going to try and share my screen as well. Okay, it seems I don't have access to share my screen, so I'm just going to continue.
Sorry to come in there. Let us just assist by providing access to Tlengiwe, please. I think the organizers will do that now, and maybe you just try again. Sorry about that, Tlengiwe.
All right, it seems that I can share now. Okay, so I hope my screen is visible. I'll be speaking on the inclusion of refugees in terms of access to healthcare. And just to give an overview of Lawyers for Human Rights, we're an organization that was founded in 1979, and the Refugee and Migrant Rights Program, which I'm working in, started around 96, responding to the plight of vulnerable migrants and people seeking refugee protection. We also, within our refugee program, have the detention monitoring unit, as well as the walk-in law clinics, which there are four of them in South Africa. And we also include a strategic litigation unit and the Statelessness Project, which is the only project of its kind in South Africa. So I'm not going to, repeat what my colleagues have already said in terms of the various international and regional instruments that protect refugee rights, including the SADC Protocol, the African Charter, and the Global Compact, which is quite important because it actually solidifies quite a lot of commitments from states on tangible actions that they're going to take to protect refugees. The EU Plan of Action from 2018 specifically says or acknowledges that xenophobia impacts socio-economic rights of migrants. So moving on then, in terms of access to healthcare for refugees and migrants, in terms of the South African Constitution, the rights and it promotes and protects the rights of all who live in South Africa, including migrants and refugees. And the preamble states that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. And there's no distinction between citizens and non-nationals, as well as the Bill of Rights, ensuring that everyone within the territory of South Africa is entitled to equal treatment, human dignity, and freedom and security of the person. Looking specifically at Section 27 of the Constitution, it guarantees that everyone has the right to access to healthcare services, including reproductive health care, and no one may be refused emergency treatment. Right. Then the Immigration Act in South Africa also mentions quite interestingly that in terms of Section 44, the institutions such as hospitals and clinics, etc., also include schools, are required to report to the Director General of Home Affairs of any illegal foreigner, in inverted commas, or anyone whose status is not clear. So these are just some of the provisions that we are dealing with on a daily basis in our clinic. The Refugees Amendment Act of 2020, which has drastically changed refugee protection in South Africa, it regulates the procedure for applying for asylum for those who've fled persecution, and Section 27 of the Refugees Act provides that refugees will enjoy the full benefit of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution as a whole, except those rights that apply only to citizens, such as the right to vote. In the case of Minister of Home Affairs versus Wachanuka of 2004, the court held that asylum seekers enjoy the same rights as South African citizens are entitled to. I think that was a typo there. Then moving on to the National Health Act of 2003, which obviously relates to the right to health. This act is enacted to give effect to the state's constitutional duties regarding the provision of healthcare services, and it recognizes that everyone has the right to access to healthcare, specifically recognizing children's rights to healthcare. So that echoes the Constitution. It also echoes the Refugees Act. Looking at where we are in Gauteng in South Africa, we've noticed some drastic policy changes, right? In the provincial, well, in terms of the Constitution, provincial governments are empowered to make their own law. So the Gauteng Hospitals Ordinance of 1958 applies specifically to the access to healthcare for all people within the province. And on the 25th of June last year, looking specifically at, COVID times, I guess, the regulations to this ordinance were amended, and they introduced numerous regulations that are contrary to the National Health Act, which says that everyone, regardless of their citizenship or their immigration status, is entitled to free primary healthcare services. Now, the ordinance in going against the National Health Act obviously goes against the Constitution. What does this mean specifically in practice? It means that even documented refugees and asylum seekers are treated as private patients, and they are charged the highest level of fees, and they don't apply the means test to check what is the income of the person who is seeking medical assistance. They are automatically treated as private patients. So the primary healthcare services are supposed to be free of charge, and higher levels of care are regulated, and they are subject to fees on a sliding scale. In general, there are three groups of patients: full paying patients, subsidized patients, and those who are free users. Specifically, free users will be generally people who are over the age of 60 and people who are earning, have a social grant, getting support from the state. So migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers are supposed to be subjected to a means test, calculating the fee that they're supposed to pay depending on their income. This procedure also applies to South Africans, so there should be no discrimination. But we find hospitals are not doing this, clinics are not doing this. The new regulations are an unlawful regression in access to healthcare for asylum seekers, refugees, and undocumented migrants from the SADC region, including children, because obviously the parent follows the status, the child follows the status of the parent. So if the parent has a refugee permit and they are discriminated based on that, then the child that they're bringing to the hospital or the clinic will also be subject to that discrimination. These regulations also deny healthcare services to migrants who can't afford high healthcare tariffs, and they violate these rights guaranteed, as I said, in the Constitution, the National Health Act, and the Refugees Amendment Act. Refugees and asylum seekers have the same rights to access to healthcare as South African citizens, and I, keep on emphasizing this. What is the impact of this discriminatory policy and practice towards refugees and migrants? So I speak of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers because we assist the whole group of non-citizens, regardless of their status. So we see that it affects people regardless of their document status. So migrant adults and children and youth generally don't travel to South Africa to access healthcare, but they may require it. It's a normal consequence of life. So migrants are often unfairly blamed for placing a burden on an already strained healthcare system. So we know even as South African citizens, there are some limits to the access to healthcare that we can get, but unfortunately, the burden affects refugees and migrants quite severely. So access to services, specifically healthcare, has been controversially discussed at a political level. For example, when the current Minister of Home Affairs was still the Minister of Health, made very concerning comments about refugees and migrants burdening the healthcare system. Also at a societal level, quite harmful utterances made by people in general, resulting in decision makers often paying less attention to non-nationals' health needs. So these are just societal attitudes that filter all the way through, sometimes to policy and practice. So these, among others, often fuel various forms of violence towards specifically poor foreigners living in South Africa. There are instances where these attitudes then, inform very, violent behavior towards migrants and refugees, among others. So the COVID-19 crisis has made worse access to health for migrants in two ways. Firstly, asylum seeker and refugee permit holders cannot renew their documents due to the closure of refugee reception offices. Since the 16th of March, 2020, the refugee reception offices have been closed and refugees and asylum seekers have not been able to renew their documents in any way. So an online renewal system resumed on the 15th of April this year, more than a year after lockdown started. The system has been criticized by refugees as being quite slow. COVID-19 permits that are issued by the online system are not trusted, and many refugees cannot apply online. So if you, for example, arrived in South Africa prior to the 26th, if your document expired prior to 26 February 2020, you may not access the online system. We're waiting for the Department of Home Affairs to issue some sort of directive as to when this group of people will be assisted. The consequence of that is that refugees and asylum seekers are automatically classified as private patients, even if they have the support of the Minister of Home Affairs in terms of automatically extending their permits by periodic regulations. The second consequence is that children, which is quite important, born during the lockdown period, don't receive their birth certificates at all, or they don't receive them on time due to their parents' documents expiring. And the late registration of births carries fines, and that has a severe impact on parents, refugee parents who don't have the income to pay those fees. And obviously that affects access to education and other services. So a general overview of the current legal framework pertaining to refugees, asylum seekers, and various categories of migrants presents a limitation of human rights. It's increasingly more difficult to find a pathway to South African citizenship. The Refugees Act was amended, for example. What do I mean by a pathway to citizenship? The Refugees Act was amended to increase the number of years to get certification for permanent residency from 5 years to 10 years. So a refugee who has certification from the South African government that they will remain a refugee indefinitely, previously had to wait 5 years, had to hold that certificate for 5 years before they can apply for permanent residency. Now, with the new Refugees Act, you've got to hold that certificate for 10 years before you can apply for citizenship. And obviously that excludes you from being able to, access healthcare services on a certain scale. The Citizenship Act, for example, the regulations present many impracticalities in that there is no official form that allows children born in South Africa to foreign parents to apply for citizenship by naturalization. So if a foreign child is born in South Africa and their parents are refugees and they have no connection at all to their country of origin, they should have a pathway to citizenship within South Africa. But that process has become increasingly difficult, even though there has been litigation to try and force the Department of Home Affairs to enable that process to take place. So how is in the South African context, how are we moving towards exclusion instead of inclusion? The constitutional provisions have set quite high standards, but these guarantees in the Constitution are quite limited. As we saw in the Grootboom judgment, that it depends on available state resources. So for example, when we say that access to healthcare is guaranteed, you're dealing with a healthcare system that is under a lot of strain. And even citizens struggle to access those services as well. Even though the Grootboom case wasn't about healthcare, it was about housing, but the principle remains. How is South Africa excluding refugees? For example, restricting refugee access to socio-economic rights, like the right to health, which I'm speaking on, and narrowing the path to citizenship and permanent residency. And these barriers, I submit, have moved from hurdles to walls, and the lack of implementation of key legislative provisions, as well as unlawful practices, becoming policy and a law unto themselves, such as the practice of not allowing refugees and asylum seekers to be subjected to a means test before they access healthcare services. I'll just give an example of, what normally happens. It's quite common that if you are a refugee and your document is not accepted by the hospital, you're forced to sign an acknowledgement of debt, which can go upwards of hundreds of thousands of rands before they can even give you emergency health care. And that is becoming a common practice, which is quite concerning. The DHA delays in enforcing court orders as well. There are some judgments where the Department of Home Affairs has agreed to enforce socio-economic rights of refugees, but it takes long to have those enforced and to find that our clients can benefit from those judgments. There's low accountability from law and policy makers and administrators as well, specifically administration. When you're trying to access healthcare, there is or it's very difficult to get through to an administrator who can assist in accessing emergency healthcare or in interpreting correctly the National Health Act and the policies that are supposed to apply. The anti-migrant attitudes that we have, as a South African society, we are plagued by that, and it remains unchecked on most levels, whether it's law, policy, society, and some state institutions. I think that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lengiwe. If you could just also stop the sharing so we can return to the screen. I think that was really exceedingly informative, detailed presentation. We really appreciate that. There is a recording being made, so for people who want to revert back to that, I'm sure we'll share the recording also with you. And thank you for that presentation, Tlangiwe. So we move next to the last of our speakers, and that is Dr. Calixte Cavuro. Dr. Cavuro is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Stellenbosch at the Public Law Department there. Before that, I see, Dr. Cavuro, you studied at all the three, Cape Town environment universities, Stellenbosch, UWC, and University of Cape Town. And he focuses in his work on socio-economic rights of refugees. So I think his presentation will be on health with a particular focus, perhaps also again on South Africa, but perhaps also broader in the African context. Dr. Cavuro, thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm honored to be with you today, and I wanted to share with you my view with regard to access to the right to health. But as I may say, it will be a bit difficult because when you speak after someone who has went through of the issues you wanted to present, you needed to find a way of reconciling them. But my presentation does not include economic migrants, is restricted only to refugees and asylum seekers. I wanted to share with you my presentation.
Thank you. We can see it, Dr. Cavuro. Go ahead.
Okay. So my presentation is all about inclusion of refugees in health in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the South African perspective. I started looking at the general state of health for asylum seekers. As all of us may be aware, the well-being of asylum seekers and refugees is intrinsically challenged by ill health. Or more often than not, individuals seeking asylum carry insufficient food with them, which cannot sustain them during their journey into exile or during the initial integration in a country of asylum. While walking or traveling often through difficult terrains or open sea to the nation, they are faced with the violence, dehydration, malnutrition, hunger, exhaustion, and increasing vulnerability to ill health. Prior to fleeing, some of them were victims of armed violence or suffered from trauma associated with violence, torture, or displacement. All these experiences significantly contribute to post-displacement ill health or diseases. So access to healthcare in South Africa, I looked at the constitutional guarantee. My colleague has taken you through it. So the right to healthcare in South Africa is guaranteed by Section 27, subsection 1, paragraph A, which confers the right to have access to healthcare services, including reproductive healthcare on every human being living within South Africa. Section 27, subsection 3, it says that no one may be refused emergency medical treatment. Section 28 provides the right of a child with respect to basic health care, whereas Section 35 also talks about detained persons or sentenced prisoners, say that they cannot be refused the medical treatment. So these are the 4 provisions in our constitution which protects the right to health. So I proceed to see the constitutional obligations of the state. And the constitutional obligation of the state is enshrined in Section 27, subsection 2, which imposes an obligation of the state through reasonable, extractive, and other measures to give effect to this right. This obligation is made subject to the principle of progressive realization and the availability of national resources. So what are those legislative, the other measures? Legislative measures, we have the National Health Act of 2003, we have the Refugees Act. Other measures, we have its user guide, uniform patients fee schedule, UPF policy, the National Health Insurance. We have a white paper, and we have a 2019 bill, which is still in the process of being enacted. We have the 2007, 2011 HIV and AIDS and the STI National Strategic Plan for South Africa, and the 2007 ART and the Revenue Directives of the National Department of Health. Okay, in this context, I wanted to state that when it comes to provinces, as we know that each and every provinces enacts its own policies in order to implement this, the legislative measures, the national health care, like my colleague indicated. You see that the province of Gauteng has got Hospital Ordinance Act, which was enacted in 2020. I looked at the national and international refugee protection. So in this context, I stated that when I look at the national and international refugee protection, I wanted to allude to shortcomings, to legal gaps that lead to complications, or that creates problems of having access to the right to health care. So you will see that the right to health care is not expressly covered by the 1951 Refugee Convention. Even it's not covered by the Refugees Act itself, as amended by the Refugees Amendment Act of 2008. This raises, therefore, a number of issues regarding the manner in which it can be assessed by and availed to refugees and asylum seekers in view of the constitutional standards, in view of the international standards of favorable treatment, because the favorable treatment is mandated by the 1951 Refugee Convention, which states that refugees must be given favorable treatment, because the 1951 Refugee Convention takes that approach in order to differentiate from equal treatment, which is afforded to citizens. However, in terms of the Refugees Act, we have the same approach. We don't have a favorable treatment, rather we have a equal treatment according to citizens. So the problem is that the 2018 repealed the express provision of the right to have access to the same basic health services offered to citizens, rendering the accessibility of basic health care service uncertain. The National Health Care Act for 2003 is not harmonized with the Refugees Act. For this reason, refugees and asylum seekers are not classified as poor, vulnerable people in terms of the National Health Act, who must have access to free health care services. The absence of such explicit recognition is contrary to the recognition in case law as a vulnerable group of South African society. Under Section 2, 4, 39, and 70 of the National Health Act, the term vulnerable group is used to refer to women, children, older persons, and persons with disabilities. So in this context, refugees and asylum seekers who are women, children, older persons, and persons with disabilities should qualify for free health care services. So, however, the access is restricted by the fact that they are non-citizens, and that restriction is in practice. So, user guide, Uniform Patients Fee Schedule, provides a guide to the charges for healthcare services on the basis of social and economic status of patients. This UPF policy, that's one, provides for a mini test when people want to have access to healthcare services. Therefore, they subjected to mini test in order to see whether you qualify in one of these three groups. These three groups are full-paying patients, partially subsidized patients, and fully subsidized patients who are entitled to free healthcare services. So full paying patients normally include all types of non-citizens. So in that context, they include refugees and they include the asylum seekers. Fully subsidized patients are the most vulnerable in society according to UPFS policy, and they are defined to include the pensioners, the unemployed, people with disabilities, and individuals who cannot afford the public hospital fees. So the UPFS policy has the way it defines the most vulnerable, which is different from the National Health Act. As per UPFS policy, you will find that refugees and asylum seekers must pay hospital fees in full. So in this context, certain clinic and hospital policies exclude them from free healthcare services because they are not viewed as a vulnerable group. We have the National Health Insurance, the white paper and the bill. So in this context, the 2011 National Health Insurance white paper restricts eligibility for free national health insurance to citizens with permanent residence. It states, however, that refugees must be treated in terms of the Refugees Act. So the Refugees Act, I will come back to it. The 2019 National Health Insurance Bill, on the other hand, extends the national health insurance to include refugees and accords asylum seekers emergency medical services and the services for notifiable conditions of public health concern. The 2019 National Health Bill further recognizes children for asylum seekers, which it accords basic health care services. So in my introduction, as I noted that asylum seekers suffer from various health concerns caused by torture, caused by persecution, war, and long and distressful journey to exile. They should be entitled to primary health care, not only the emergency medical services. As my colleague has noted, is that when you look at it, you will find that in most cases, access to healthcare services is restricted by delays in documentation. So is this approach we have the National Health Insurance Bill harmonized with the Refugees Act. So the Refugees Act introduces two different approaches treatment of refugees. One is for refugees, another is for asylum seekers. Section 27, subsection B of the Refugees Act states that refugees are subjected to the principle of full legal protection with regard to those rights in the Bill of Rights that apply to each and everyone. So those rights include social and economic rights and benefits. Section 27, capital A, subsection D of the Refugees Act accords the asylum seekers universal constitutional rights. Those are rights that apply to each and everyone in terms of the Constitution. So, however, this provision does not subject them to full legal protection principle. So, question arises, to what extent they should be protected or have access to health care services if such a right is not fully protected. So what it means is that refugees must receive a better treatment than asylum seekers. That is why you see that the National Health Insurance excludes them from free primary health care services. And therefore it restricts or it only subjects them to emergency medical treatment. So it tries to apply two different approaches, which was created by the Refugees Act. But when you look into other policies, you will find that they have different approaches, because the 2007-2011 HIV/AIDS and the ACTI National Strategic Plan for South Africa defines refugees and asylum seekers as marginalized groups that must be protected from discrimination. As marginalized groups, they have a right to equal access to interventions for HIV prevention, treatment, and support. Yet, the 2007 ART and the Revenue Directives of the National Department of Health stresses that refugees and asylum seekers with or without documents need to be excused from paying for antiretroviral therapy services, regardless of the site or level of institution where these services are offered. So in other words, or put it succinctly, the directive recognizes the challenges that refugees and the asylum seekers face in accessing documentation from the Department of Home Affairs within a reasonable time period, because this is the issue my colleague has raised, where you find that asylum seekers are taken away by hospitals, are reported to the police on the basis of illegality, where you find them being arrested, detained, and subjected to deportation. So the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, in that context, healthcare policies that seek to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic should be harmonized with the Refugees Act. They should use the same approach used by the National Health Insurance Bill, the 2007 and the 2011 HIV/AIDS and the STI National Strategic Plan for South Africa. The same approach used by the 2007 ART and the Revenue Directives for the National Department of Health. It should recognize refugees and asylum seekers as vulnerable people in the South African society. So I conclude my presentation by providing recommendations. And the first one is that the National Health Act must be revised to be harmonized with the Refugees Act. There's a need to recognize refugees and asylum seekers as a part of vulnerable groups to qualify for free healthcare services. And those sections that must be revised, it's Section 2, Section 4, 39, and 70. Furthermore, I have not been alluded or spoken to this, which I came to recommendations, but the National Health Act also restricts the transplantation of an organ into a refugee patient. Therefore, here I'm recommending that this section should be amended to allow a transplantation of an organ into a refugee patient who are in the greatest need of such a transplantation for their survival. The UPFS policy also should be classify refugees as fully subsidized patients, and they should be subjected to the testing, to the means test, in order to see whether they fall. Because we know that although refugees are vulnerable, we know that some are employed, some are carrying out their businesses, so they should be subjected to the means test in order to see in order to determine their social and economic conditions. The UPFS policy should define the treatment of asylum seekers, and the asylum seekers must include those who are documented and those who are undocumented. The state should subject new asylum seekers to medical screening, because it is the issue of concern where we say that the asylum seekers are not subject or allowed to have access to free healthcare services. And as I mentioned, the difficulties they go through. And you find, for example, perhaps if I can give an example, if a woman comes in as an asylum seeker from a war-torn country where she was led and have contacted various diseases, and allowed to be integrated in the society without screening or conducting any medical screening on that asylum seekers, then it becomes problematic. So I'm recommending that there should be medical screening of newly asylum seekers in order to detect the diseases and in order to ensure immediate and appropriate emergency treatment. So the state should include refugees and asylum seekers in the COVID-19 healthcare services and the COVID-19 vaccination program. I think I concluded on this depending on what I was given, and therefore I thank you everyone who is participating in this forum.
Thank you very, very much. That was really, again, very informative. I think you can just stop the screening. So we'll go back to the main screen. Dr. Cavuro, thank you for that detailed discussion. I think we had the privilege now to listen to two people really engaging on the South African response. And I think that is not to focus on South Africa because it's exceptional, but I think also because it does provide lessons that are both positive and negative, I think, in this context. So, Dr. Adeni, we lost you for a moment there. I would, if you are back, we will give you a minute and a half. We are running a little bit out of time. We want to have a bit of discussion. So we are going to go back to Dr. Adeni, Michael. But before I do that, let me kind of give early warning, as it were, to the other presenters. I will pick up two issues that I see recur in the chat box, and perhaps go around the same sequence that we've been and hear people's views. The first is the suggestion or the inquiry about the pathway, as it were, from refugee status having been determined to citizenship. So the question is, why isn't there, in a sense, an automatic pathway from your refugee status being determined to citizenship? How can this be sped up, made more almost of necessity and much easier? What are the kind of obstacles, and can people in the panel perhaps speak to that progression? The second issue that I think we've seen a long and interesting debate in the chat room about the whole question of let me call it balancing. On the one hand, we have COVID that actually caused the existing economic depression in our countries to be exacerbated. Communities, host communities where refugees are often located and based are already under severe strain. The government is not able to provide often the basic social services, including education, health, but also even water and housing and so on. Now, you have the plight, the very important, understandable plight of refugees in those very similar circumstances. How does one balance? How does the state, what are the obligations? I think some of the speakers did speak to that, but specifically look at the international standard of the available resources. How does one understand the concept of the government's obligation to take concrete and targeted steps within its available resources in this context? How can that balance be struck in a way that also speaks to the kind of legitimacy issues for the government in those contexts? So those are the two questions I want us to discuss. But as I say, before we go to our panelist, Dr. Adeni, Michael, we go back to you just for a brief conclusion. We perhaps know that we unfortunately lost your train of thought there, but if you can just wrap it up in a minute or two, we'll really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franz. I can't share my PPTs because it has been disabled. So I would like to quickly
focus on the main points, if you don't mind.
Yes. So I'm going straight to the main points. So from my research, I identify some challenges undermining the rights of refugees to education in Uganda. And the first one is that even though the Act and the Constitution provide for rights of education of refugee children, still some schools in Uganda still charge fees. And due to the socio-economic condition of refugees, they are not able to cater for these charges. World Bank conducted a research which also validates this assertion. So this is the major impediment to refugees' right to education. Therefore, these are the policy interventions that I recommend. The first one is that the government of Uganda and UNHCR should strive to reduce poverty and mitigate the risk for vulnerable refugees and their host communities. The close involvement of key stakeholders such as district leaders, sector ministries, including education, and host communities is very important. The next is that there should be a shift in the philosophy of refugee rights protection. This is very crucial. So this calls for a comprehensive approach to enhance refugees, especially girls and women's access to education, healthcare, and to reduce general security and safety risk among refugees. And the last policy recommendation is the integration of social services and activities such as education and healthcare interventions to reduce, to inform deeper situational, to be informed by deeper situational analysis in the 9 refugee hosting districts, including Adjumani, Hoima, Mbale, and the capital city, which is Kampala. These recommendations will go a long way to ensure that refugee children and even adults are not denied their right to education because of their socio-economic conditions. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity to share my research findings.
Thank you very much, Michael, Dr. Adeni. Yes, so we will then go to our panelists. Dr. Adeni, you also heard the question. So those 2 issues of the pathway from refugee status having been determined to citizenship, and the balancing act in the light of the requirement to use available resources in a judicial way. Let us go to you, Dr. Aleone Bebe, if you would like to respond to those or give your thoughts. Thank you very much, Aleone.
Thank you, Professor Franz and this distinguished panelists for those excellent presentations, and we'll also try to engage in the chat. There are a few things when we talk about, how to celebrate and mark this Refugee Day with, learning and healing and shining, and how do we let people shine if we don't find solutions and provide dignified services to them? And I think you spot on when you talked about how to balance this, the reality of refugees in camp setting with limited access to resources and ambition that's reflected in legislations and international and regional standards. And I think this, for every human rights student, this is always a challenge, and how to balance. And I think if I want to go back to the Global Compact on refugees, this is exactly what the aim and objective is, really to see, okay, we understand the global community coming together. We understand the challenges countries face in providing access to services. They are generous, they are giving lands, they are giving, but then of course there are resource constraints. And so with this robust international solidarity and resource funding, and also really opening it up beyond the normal state, beyond member states, but also private actors, companies, entities, like even protection, universities, giving safe way for protection or livelihood, and other actors coming together. So there is lots of hope in this process. And it has generated, it has been a catalyst for reform, legal reform, and some countries came up with new legislation allowing access to employment for refugees. Countries that are struggling to create jobs for their own citizens, how do we then materialize that access to jobs for refugees? One way we saw is, for instance, job compact, whereby countries allow refugees to have access to employment, certain percentages, and then the international financial institutions like World Bank and the African Development Bank or MFF, IMF provide some financial incentives. This is being piloted in some countries. And sometimes it's simple legal reform like access to land can really generate a potential among refugees. So it's not just the resources we are inputting, but obviously, yes, it's a major challenge. When it comes to the issue of access to nationality, I'm currently working in South Sudan. If you are someone who has lived here for 10 years, you can apply for citizenship in South Sudan. And so we have some protracted case loads like DRC refugees in South Sudan who have been here for more than 10 years. So we are looking at how this group can be included. We don't believe that there is a requirement of, refugee status to have access. If you are a kind of community that is at the risk of statelessness, there are different pathways to that. And that's why we are working to identify groups that face risk of statelessness and then allow them to access. And the government already, Ministry of Interior, for instance, in South Sudan is our champion, our kind of focal person around this. We are looking at possibility of identifying these groups to promote access to South Sudan. And there is promise again in this regard to make some achievements. Just moderator, just 1 minute if you allow me. Just also a topic that we haven't touched really. You mentioned sport, and this is another very critical area for us. Sport is not just an entertainment, it is also really, especially for children, the right to play and get meaning and dignity. And so soon we'll be having 29 refugees in Tokyo. This is among, this significant opening. We never done it before, working with the Olympic Committee and making sure that refugees and in countries that are represented in this refugee community, this has created significant boost in morale among refugees. And also we have networks of football federation in Africa with whom we are working to promote access to sport, and also using sport, especially if you are a refugee in camp setting and with no access to this, we have found it to be very, very critical. Just to close with one point around COVID-19, we have seen not only issue around access to services, but also border closures and significant reduction of refugee registration because we had to cut services around registration, for instance, 42% globally. And that means significant challenge when it comes to access to services. I can't imagine what refugees are now going through places like Uganda, where there is major lockdown. So we are also monitoring protection development in those countries and to see what kind of business continuity plan we can have with partners trying to provide some services. We have hotlines where refugees can call in for services. We beat on protection and assistance, cash assistance program to really help refugees gain some access even during this difficult time. But again, the consequence of COVID-19 is going to be with us for some time. And that's why I think the vision and the response to this challenge can't be just on government or UNHCR, but everybody. That's why I feel there is so much hope now, especially if we are creative, using academic institutions, using private institutions, and individuals, us. Many of us who are in this call, we can make those contributions using the kind of opportunity and privilege that we have. Over to you, Professor Franz.
Thank you very much. And thank you also, Aleone, for taking us back to sport and linking it to dignity and search for meaning. I think let us go and to Dr. Samar, Walters. And Walters, if you also want to pick on anything else that came out in the chat box, or you also would like to add something to the reflections around sport, since we didn't really get to that in the main discussions. You're most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think I just would like to talk about one of the issues you raised, the pathway to citizenship for refugees. And following on what Dr. Abebe just said, I'm looking at some of the resource challenges and the legal challenges. But what I think is, I think I'm a political man. What I think is, regardless of all the resource and the legal challenges, when there is a political will, all of that can be overcome. We see a country like Uganda, and which is often credited as a refugee welcoming country. It's not because the country is rich. It's not because they have the resources. It's simply because there is a political will. And I'm thinking of a situation where people go to Uganda, they are received, and avenues for them to strive economically, socially, it's available, and a lot of people go there for that reason. And you could go back to say it's Pan-Africanism that is informing Ugandan foreign policy, even its openness to refugee. So there is really the primacy of politics, which if it's considered, and you have countries that take the necessary steps in facilitating the pathway to citizenship for refugees, it's definitely going to work, and resources would follow. In the context of the COVID pandemic, one of the lessons I think we should be learning is that, just as we are working together to address the pandemic, and the lesson is we are in it together, the same thing should be applied when it comes to refugees. It shouldn't be seen as just the problem of developing countries, their responsibility hosting refugees. Partners should come in, and that's why earlier I did emphasize on the necessity to support local communities. And this is critical because, often refugees are seen as a burden. And why do people see them as a burden? Is because when they do come, there is a strain on the resources, and the communities receiving them find it difficult to make ends meet. And when the state cannot provide, then there is xenophobia, as we have seen, whether it's in South Africa or elsewhere, against, targeting refugees. So for me, the primacy of politics is very important. And often in some countries, governments that are failing to deliver services to their people will play would even fuel xenophobia and targeting foreigners, especially, and also targeting refugees. And when it comes to sports, I think seeing that the Olympic Games are starting very soon, it's just timely to also not forget about the importance of when we talk about sports, it's everything, as Dr. Abeba was saying. It's really about the possibility for children to play, which is really what they need growing up as in those camps with limited space, with they don't have playgrounds, and often we don't not much attention is given to creating those facilities for children to play. And not only has health benefits, even for their education, those things are interlinked: health, education, and sports, and the possibility for refugee children to be able to play. So really, it's important to see refugees as an asset, and when they are perceived from that perspective, means are put in place, facilitating local communities to help themselves and, of course, help the refugees who they are hosting. These are a few points I just wanted to add on my initial presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Samar. Let us go, I think, to Dr. Adeni, Michael. Then we'll come to the two South African-focused presentations towards the end. So if you would also like to reflect on those questions posed, make some reflections around sports, or add anything that you saw in the chat room. Thank you.
Thank you very much, friends. What I would like to talk about is the Ubuntu, the African principle of Ubuntu and Pan-Africanism, that we do our best as Africans to translate it into action, even as people, as governments and other institutions in Africa. The question I would like to ask is, can an African even be a refugee in another African country? Because the problems we are facing now is the issue of otherliness. We see refugees as others, and this fuels xenophobia and Afrophobia and all these other negative stereotypes against refugees. So as individuals, government institutions working for refugees, let us strive to be embodiment of the principle of Ubuntu and the African concept of humanism, whereby we will see refugees as belonging to us, the same, devoid of tribe, ethnicities, nationality, but wherever they are, so far as they enter into another African country, it should be just as they've entered a different city in their own country. This will go a long way to make sure refugees have equitable access to social services, facilities, and utilities. And it will also solve the problem of discrimination. Thank you very much, friends.
Thank you very much, also Michael, for that. Then we turn back to Hlengiwe, but before we do so, I really invite people perhaps who are not following the chats to look at the rich discussion. I think we have, for example, David Chimba and Richard Obedi engaging in a very, I think, instructive engagement on issues, among many others. But for now, let us go to Hlengiwe Mchacha. For any comments, Hlengiwe, that you may have, or responses to those issues raised by me at the beginning of the session. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Just to try and address those two, I suppose, those salient issues that you mentioned on the pathway to citizenship for refugees, and also trying to strike a balance in terms of socio-economic rights. The South African context, which I was speaking on, has changed a lot in terms of refugee protection and allowing the pathway to citizenship. I think it's a matter of knowing what the law says on the part of refugees in educating themselves and in understanding the reality that they are facing, and also for the state to be honest about those limitations. We know that the internal appeals bodies such as the Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs, as well as the Refugees Appeal Board, have been struggling with crippling backlogs on their system in terms of refugee status determination. And they have recently been supported by the UNHCR in clearing those backlogs, specifically in the Refugees Appeal Board. So I think that's a very good example of good practice in terms of states engaging with the UNHCR or other bodies in addressing the problems that manifest in terms of refugee protection and pathways to citizenship. So when in terms of the drastic legal changes that we've seen, I think the state needs to also communicate what this means in terms of state resources and socioeconomic rights of citizens and refugees, and especially looking at the fact that South Africa does not have any camps, and we are expected, or we should socially integrate, but the citizens aren't educated. The refugees also, in some instances, they will travel the whole country trying to find UNHCR headquarters or something with UNHCR, signage, because that's what they believe, happens globally. So there is an important, sort of an urgent need to educate everyone on refugee rights, going from a social level all the way to academic level, and giving access to education for refugees and asylum seekers, that they may be in the same education environment as citizens, and they can we can pursue, I guess, the principle of Ubuntu in that way as well. So it's a matter of being aware of what the particular context that we are in, and very well, depending on the country, educating oneself as to what is the lived reality of refugees, what is the legal protection that is available to them, and in that way we can try to close the gap once we are actually aware of how things are. They may be good, they may be bad, they may be a mix of both, but it's very important to educate oneself, because we know South Africans are generally quite ignorant as to refugee rights. And even in our universities, we don't study refugee law generally. I did not study refugee law, but I ended up practicing it. So those are some of the issues that, some of the things that we can do to try and assist in terms of the socioeconomic protection of refugees. And then in terms of the second issue of balancing socioeconomic rights, I really don't have any, innovative or answers in terms of that, but it really needs multi-stakeholders. Refugee issues are not just for the UNHCR, they are not just for refugee lawyers and activists. These issues spread across the board. Wherever refugees are, human rights should have a vested interest in assisting and protecting refugees. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you again for those very, I think, insightful reflections relating South Africa also to a broader African context. Let us go to Dr. Cavuro, but before we do, let me just say I appreciate, I see a very high percentage of our participants are still here. It's certainly testimony to the very rich presentations made by our panelists. We will try to finish off at the top of the hour. So after Dr. Cavuro, I am really going to go around the panelists again for literally 1 minute. So your take home, your punch, your last punch, your few sentences that you just want to, in conclusion, direct to our audience, having looked maybe at the chat box and reflected on the discussion as a whole. So after Dr. Cavuro's more general presentation reply, we will go back to each of our panelists for this short summary statement. Dr. Cavuro, over to you for reflections on the issues of citizenship and the balance and any aspect of South Africa and a refugee response that also you want to expand on.
Okay, thank you, Prof, for this time again to speak to our audience. I'm not sure if I'm audible to you.
Yes, you can go ahead.
Yes. We have the main issues that we face here in South Africa is that we have a legislation, which is the Refugees Act, but you find that in many cases, the Refugees Act is not harmonized with the other laws and the policies that give effect to social and economic rights. For example, as I mentioned, that if we have the National Health Act, which does not speak to the Refugees Act, then it will be problematic for refugees and asylum seekers to be able to have access to social health care services. Another example I can give, it's where refugees and asylum seekers want to have access to tertiary education. In that case, you will find that the NSFAS Act, which is the National Student Financial Aid Assistance, does not speak to the Refugees Act. In that context, you find that students who are refugees and asylum seekers are excluded from social support provided by the state. So you find that in many cases, bursaries and loans which are available are provided by private institutions, but we haven't seen or noticed any effort on the side of government, where the government also attempts or tries to meet its constitutional obligation in order to ensure that asylum seekers and refugees acquires skills and develops their talents in that context. On that point, I will say that when you look, for example, the right to have access to adequate housing, you will find that the Housing Act does not speak to the Refugees Act. In that context, you will find that the housing program excludes refugees and asylum seekers, where shelter to refugees is supposed to be a key to protection, but they don't have any access to shelters, to housing provided by the state. One of the participants noted that how the government can be able to provide free healthcare services when it does not even provide food for refugees, does not provide nutrition for children, for example. Because of that, when you look at the manner in which the government approaches the protection of asylum seekers, you'll find that asylum seekers are excluded from all aspects of social and economic rights, because politically they are viewed as economic migrants who come in South Africa for other opportunities. So until, according to the state, they are recognized as genuine refugees, they cannot have access to social welfare programs. So that is an approach which is applied by the South African government since the adoption of the Refugee Act in 1998, which came into force in 2000. And then it comes to the issue of documentation, the issue of legal status and positions of asylum seekers and the refugees in the South African community. Because when a person comes from his or her own country, fleeing to South Africa, the first they are recognized as asylum seekers, for example. But because of backlog on the side of Home Affairs, an asylum seekers can stay in that position for quite a number of years, more than 5 years, as an asylum seeker in the country. So in that period, it means that an asylum seeker does not have access to any socio-economic rights, including even social assistance, because they are not beneficiaries of social assistance. Only refugees are only individuals who can be able to have access to social assistance. So when it takes a period of 5 years, while living in the country as an asylum seeker, and then you are recognized as a refugee, genuine refugees, after 5 years, and then the state says that from that day you are recognized as a refugee, that is, we need to count 10 years. So after 10 years, you will be a person is eligible to apply for permanent residence permit. And the permanent residence permit is not automatic because it requires you to apply from the Standing Committee for Refugee Affairs to be accepted or to approve your application that you can be a permanent resident of South Africa. And that application also can delay for another 3 to 5 years. So when you find that a person to be able to be integrated in society as a permanent resident, it can take an asylum seeker 20 years in a row or 25 years in a row. Sure. And so you are recognized as a permanent resident.
Yes. Dr. Cavuro? Yes, Dr. Cavuro. Yes, thank you.
To be able to apply for citizenship. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. And sorry to jump in there, but that was a very, very rich response. And thank you. We'll take that also as your last remarks also. I'm going to just jump in the inverse order and ask Tlengiwe if you would also in a few seconds just give us your wrap-up statement, takeaway statement. Thank you, Tlengiwe.
Yes, thank you, Professor. I'm struggling a bit. My internet is starting to be problematic, but I will be very brief and also not turn on my video. I apologize for that. Yeah, just a takeaway. Last comment is to say, you know, we, those of us who are practicing daily, you know, dealing with refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, etc. We see the stark reality, especially in a country where there are no camps and the state does not really provide as much protection and social assistance, psychosocial assistance as well to deal with the trauma of seeking refuge in South Africa. We're appealing to, you know, our friends in the sector and to, you know, everyone in this virtual room to pull together in terms of whatever resources we have in educating. I think the most important thing that I have noted, you know, in the daily work that we do, is that people are just not aware whether they are at a high level of education or whether it's someone who is at the border trying to process someone who is seeking refuge in South Africa and applying the wrong law, asking the wrong questions and taking them through the wrong process, ending up with, you know, detention and refoulement, etc., violation of international law, in trying to address the plight of refugees and asylum seekers. So ideally it would be, you know, my wish that people who are outside of, who are not specifically interested in refugee issues are also educated about them and have an understanding of the personal experience of a person who doesn't choose but is compelled to leave their home, their family, and everything that they know to seek a life somewhere else where they may not speak the language, they may not even be familiar with the geography of the place, and they are putting their life at risk just to escape a bigger risk where they are coming from. So those are my closing remarks, and hopefully we can make progress rather than moving backwards, as we have seen in the South African legal context, at least. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those, I think, inspiring remarks, and for your presentation as a whole. Calixte, we really appreciate. Then we go back to you, Michael, Dr. Adeni, for your concluding thought, briefly. So please, thanks.
Thank you, Franz. So I would like to touch on the fact that the African Union and various sub-regional supranational institutions should try to address the root causes of conflict and instability in various African countries that is making them refugee-producing countries. The second one is that we should try as much as possible to make encampment a temporary situation. Maximum 3 months, refugees should be allowed to integrate into the host communities, and there should be the need for context-specific interventions to ensure that refugees are able to work, they're able to access health facilities and educational services in the host community. Therefore, as Africans, we have to also try to educate our families, our friends, our communities, and every opportunity that we get. We should educate them about Ubuntu and other Pan-African solidarity ideologies and concepts, so that Africans will see Africa as a home. Africa as a continent will be a home to every African. I think this will go a long way to address the issue of Africans being refugees in other African countries where their fundamental human rights are denied. Thank you very much, Franz.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that, Michael. And then we return to you, Dr. Walters Samar, for your concluding observation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Very briefly, I should just emphasize what I said earlier, that to better assist refugees, host communities should receive enhanced and predictable support from the state and from the international community. That's just one key message. And a second message is efforts must be made to put former refugees at the forefront of this, fight for increased access to these social services to refugees. I think of UNICEF, UNSCR, international organizations hiring former refugees who, in my view, are one of the best messengers in sensitizing and even educating and empowering refugees to be able to, take advantage of, defend their rights, and also to take advantage of the services that are provided in different countries where they are living. Thank you very much, and I wish to also thank the Center for the opportunity given to me to share my perspective on this very important topic. Thank you.
As they say, no, it is us who thank you, Dr. Samar, but thank you so much for those thoughts. And lastly, not leastly, certainly Dr. Alehone Abebe, for your concluding statement, as it were. Thank you, Alehone.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you to this community of human rights defenders, students, and community workers and academicians. And I think for me, yes, refugees can heal. Yes, refugees can shine if we invest, among others, on education. And yes, we understand the reality, a significant challenge by governments and communities who have to share their resources. We can only address this if we are innovative. We have to really shed this traditional human rights approach that we have. We only focus on obligation of states, but really mobilize everybody, including the private sector, including faith-based organizations, traditional institutions, and artists, and in line with the global compact for refugees on refugees' ambition. That's why I believe each of us will have a role to play, including the center. My hope is that next year we'll have 1 or 2 refugees, and also allowing them to have voice in this kind of discussions. Maybe this is an area where we can also improve having access to refugees and IDPs to be among panelists, and so that they also articulate their vision. And I saw some interesting observation in the chat. For instance, UNHCR, you talk about employment for refugees. Do you create jobs for refugees? Yes, we do. We actually employ refugees to be teachers, through our partners to be health officers and level. So that's also an area that's really expanding. Last year, we raised more than $200 million from private individuals to provide assistance. That's a significant leap in terms of how we mobilize resources. Yes, each of you can contribute, and then hopefully all of us will contribute to the finding solutions for refugees. Over to you, and thank you so much on behalf of UNHCR for really allowing us to be a part of this conversation. Over to you.
Thank you. So let me just say very briefly also my concluding appreciation. I think what we got today, all of us in various dimensions, various time zones, first of all, perhaps knowledge, interesting, important knowledge was shared. So I hope many of us felt that we increased our knowledge. But more importantly, I think at the second level, that there were certain very enlightening moments, new insights, and perhaps the opportunity to question our accepted wisdom, just see something in a new perspective, the whole issue around balancing, the whole issue of perhaps nothing about us without us, also being applied to and applicable to people who are refugees or asylum seekers. So very important. And lastly, I think most importantly, perhaps that we all have a sense of how does my organization fit into this? Charity begins at home. How can we all contribute? Tertiary education was mentioned on a number of occasions. I think we as a center and others should really reflect on how we can forge alliances, work with some of you to identify the most suitable candidates, for example, in our master's program in human rights or otherwise. I think that is a challenge that we can really live up to. And whether it is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights itself, looking also at employing people within the organization, not just as perhaps people doing teaching jobs and so on, and for all of us in whatever ways we think our work can be enriched by our discussions here. I think it was very, very fruitful to have engaged together. So my thanks, my sincere thanks go to our presenters in the first place, all of them. They really were excellent. If we had a round of applause, we'd all be loudly applauding now, I'm very sure. To our participants for devoting your time, your attention to not only the issue, but also the issue as presented here. We hope to build on this in due course. And also to everyone who made this possible from our side, substantively, Abi Ashanafi and Tunde Enekbokan, technically Yolanda and Teruna, the whole team at the Center for Human Rights. Let me just highlight in conclusion one comment from Professor El-Matman, and that is that we should take note of the creation of the African Migration Observatory in Rabat in Morocco. That is one of the most recent African Union specialized agencies created in 2020. It is focused exactly on the issues that we are talking about here. And I think if one just thinks about forging alliances and working together also with this important new African Union institution, some profit may have come from this specific engagement today. So thank you very much once again, everyone who's been here and everyone who made this possible. We will certainly continue the work and let us continue celebrating Africa's and the world's refugees, but not in a facile way, but in a way that engages us in their plights and well-being. Good afternoon, good morning, good day.
Thank you, bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.